Good evening. I'm Ann Guerin with the Washington Post, and thank you to Freedom House, to the Roel Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the Jewish community of Greater Stowe, and Spruce Peak Arts for sponsoring this evening's conversation. Our topic tonight is authoritarianism and democratic decline. And we want to take a particular look at how authoritarians have taken advantage of the coronavirus pandemic, about which Freedom House has just published a report. I covered the White House at the Washington Post, and before that I covered the State Department, Pentagon, Supreme Court, and various other institutions in Washington. And although I've never been based overseas, much of my career has been spent trying to write about and understand the way other countries relate to the United States and the United States to them. And I am extremely pleased to spend a little bit of this evening on the virtual dais with two experts on democracy and human rights. Erwin Cutler is the chair of the Roel Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice, Attorney General of Canada, longtime member of Parliament in Canada, and an international human rights lawyer. We're going to hear a little bit tonight about some of his work in particular cases, and I look forward to hearing his perspective. Mike Abramowitz is the president of Freedom House, and before that, Mike was director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education. And before that, when I first knew Mike, he was an ink-stained wretch like me. He was the national editor and also a White House correspondent at the Washington Post. And we miss you, Mike, in the newsroom. Again, thank you to our sponsors and a bit about our format. Erwin and Mike will both present briefly, and then we will have a conversation. I'll ask some questions, and then after we've gone on a bit, we will take some questions from you. A number of people in the audience have already submitted questions. If you haven't yet and would like to, you can submit questions during the event. You can do it right in the YouTube chat and they will get to us. And finally, if you would like to tweet about the event as it proceeds this evening, please use the hashtag #ReviveDemocracy. That's all one word, hashtag #ReviveDemocracy. Again, thanks everyone for being here, and I will turn first to Mike.
Thank you, Ann. And first of all, let me just say how nice it is to be with you. Just to say to our audience, you're very lucky to have one of the most distinguished diplomatic correspondents and now White House correspondents, and appreciate it's kind of a slow news cycle. So I'm sure you can easily get away.
Going on.
We're grateful. And I also wanted to say it's just a huge honor for me to be with Erwin Cutler, who is one of my human rights heroes. Really, he's a legend in the human rights world. And thank you, Erwin, for being with us. And thank you really for the work you've done on behalf of political prisoners and people of conscience the world over. It's just really nice to be with you. And if I may just say one thing, the instigator for this event tonight was my friend Ron Feinstein, who's with the Jewish community of Stowe. And sadly, we had hoped to have this event in person, but events intervened. So we have a good audience, I think, even globally tonight. So thank you, Ron, for helping push this. So as Ann said, I have the great privilege of being the president of Freedom House. And for those of you who may not know us, we were founded out of the conviction that freedom flourishes in democratic nations where governments are accountable to their people. We speak out against the main threats to democracy, and we empower citizens to exercise their fundamental rights through a unique combination of assistance to frontline defenders, and analysis and advocacy. We've been around for almost 80 years, and we are fiercely nonpartisan. We work across party lines, and among our founders were Eleanor Roosevelt, a proud Democrat, and Wendell Willkie, a proud Republican who ran against Eleanor's husband for president in 1940. And that's like kind of an amazing thing if you think about the polarization today, that people could work across the aisles for political freedom. It's deeply inspiring to me. We're likely best known for our annual assessments of global freedom. Our flagship report, Freedom of the World, was founded in the early 70s, and we grade 210 countries every year for their political rights and civil liberties. And countries are graded as free, partly free, or not free. And if the tech folks could just put up the first slide, you will be able to see our famous map. And so you see the green countries are free, the yellow are partly free, and the purple are not free. The grades come from evaluating 25 different indicators, things like the conduct of elections, free assembly, freedom of the press, judicial independence, freedom of religion. And each of these indicators is scored on a scale of 1 to 4 for a possible total of 100 points. And so some of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is based on the annual research that we do. And just one point to keep in mind, that we're not rating governments, but we measure the way that people within a country experience political rights and civil liberties. We're kind of rating their level of freedom. And the big story that we'll be discussing over the course of this evening is really the steady decline of democracy for the past 14 years. It's really the longest democracy recession since we've been tracking these scores. And essentially more countries are getting worse in our scores every year than those getting better. The decline is global. It's happening in every continent. And I would say it's being led by China and Russia, who have not only gotten more illiberal and aggressive about repressing their own peoples, but they are exporting their repression beyond their borders. But, and this is a point we can talk about a little bit more, established democracies are also backsliding. 25 of the world's 41 democracies, the 41 strongest democracies, have fallen in their scores over the last 10 years. And that's really also a concerning phenomenon. And I'm sad to say that these falling countries include the United States, which should be the world's leading democracy. And everyone is well aware of a lot of the problems we have in the current election year, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But the problems with US democracy actually predate President Trump. And we've tracked a decade of decline, taking us from a score of roughly 94 to one of 86 out of 100. And our peers were once the UK and Spain and New Zealand, and now our scores put us in the company of Greece and Estonia and Croatia. And now, as Anne indicated, the pandemic is making things worse. And so if we can turn to the second slide, please. I wanted to show you, this kind of summarizes a report that we released just last week, where we surveyed democracy and human rights experts around the world, did our own analysis, and basically came to the conclusion that during the pandemic, democracy has grown worse in some 80 countries. That's almost half the countries we evaluated. And what we found is that governments are responding to the health crisis with a kind of human rights crisis, with a democracy crisis. And they've engaged in abuses of power. They've silenced their critics. They've weakened or shuttered important institutions that often undermine the very systems of accountability that are needed to protect public health. So one thing that our survey showed is that the impact of COVID-19 on democracy is likely to stay. That we found that around 2/3 of the people we surveyed believe that there would be a long-term impact on democracy and human rights that would last at least 3 to 5 years. And just to give you one small factoid to show the problem, and I'm speaking really here like as a former ink-stained wretch, as Anne said, that at least 90 countries have imposed new restrictions on freedom of expression in the news media in the last 6 months. One country, Tanzania, whose leaders have been in total denial about the health crisis, have gone so far as to ban reporters from even reporting about the coronavirus. So it's quite a concerning situation all over the world. But let me, if I can, just close my opening on an optimistic note. At times that it feels like we're in winter with regards to democracy. But as you know, after every winter, there is spring. And I believe that spring is coming. And I think it's important just to let you know that the negative trends do not tell the whole story. Despite the pandemic, there's been a continuation of global protests around the world as demonstrators, are coming into the streets all over the world to try to hold their governments accountable. Last year, a terrible dictator in Sudan was ousted, and we saw millions of ordinary people hit the streets in Hong Kong to register their dismay about creeping authoritarianism. This year we found that even though 158 countries have new restrictions placed on protests, that's not deterring. We've identified at least 90 countries since the outbreak began where protests have continued, including our country, and the most entrenched dictator in Europe, Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus, may be on his last legs because there are just massive protests every weekend in Minsk. So there is, in other words, I think, a huge public demand for freedom, for democracy, for human rights in every corner of the world. And that we have to remind ourselves that the rights that we fight for at Freedom House and that Irwin's group fights for are not just for people in the West, but for people everywhere. And they are demanded by people everywhere. And understanding that essential truth is what really buoys me and gives me confidence that the map that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation a little earlier will one day be entirely green. So thank you very much.
Erwin?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anne, and I want to express my appreciation both to you, and I have to say that I'm a diligent reader of the Washington Post, and your mantra, democracy dies in darkness, is one that inspires me all the time. And Mike, for really your historical work, both at the time that you were heading up at the Holocaust Museum, the work there, and now with Freedom House. We are meeting really at an important inflection moment, not only where we are witnessing a global COVID problem, but we are witnessing a global COVID pandemic, but a global political pandemic characterized by a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, and you reflected the fact that we are now the 14th consecutive year of an erosion of democracy, a global assault on media freedom, and political prisoners as a looking glass both into the global political pandemic and also into the global COVID pandemic as they languish in prisons that are overcrowded, unhygienic, and at risk of COVID. So let me give a quick snapshot of each of these dynamics. The first, the resurgent global authoritarianism, finds expression in a massive assault on the rules-based international order, of which Xi Jinping's China is message and metaphor, where China and Russia and other of the authoritarian regimes like Iran or Maduro's Venezuela are characterized by not only cultures of corruption and criminality, but an impunity that underpins it. And I think it's important always to distinguish between the authoritarian leadership and the people and publics in these authoritarian regimes who are tragically the targets of massive domestic repression, but as Mike mentioned, where we see them courageously, like in Belarus and elsewhere, standing up in protest. But perhaps what is the worst thing in this framework of pandemics is the pandemic of impunity, which has continued to underpin the cultures of corruption and criminality. Let me give you just two examples of that impunity. Xi Jinping's China, notwithstanding the fact that it is engaged in mass atrocities of which the plight and pain of the Uyghurs is metaphor and message, has been awarded the Winter Olympics for 2022, though the Olympic Charter speaks about the promotion and protection of human dignity. Another example is that next Tuesday, there will be elections for the UN Human Rights Council, where in these elections, Russia will be elected, China will be elected, Saudi Arabia will be elected, they will join Venezuela. In other words, the human rights violators will be part of a council whose mandate, in effect, whose constitutional mandate is the promotion and protection of human rights. So let me go to very quickly to the second theme, and Mike has covered this well, the backsliding and retreat of the democracies. And where in the 2019 report, Mike, and this links up with media freedom, you spoke not only about the assault on media freedom that comes from the authoritarians, but assaults on media freedom that comes from the community of democracies as well. And what we are experiencing, as you put it in your 2019 report, is a threat to the extinction, really, of press freedom as we know it. And your most recent report, with respect to the COVID-19, we see that the assault has intensified, not only amongst the resurgent global authoritarians, but amongst the community of democracies. For example, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, there have been, till latest recording till mid-September, over 750 violations of press freedom relating to his case alone, and which has included violations of international media in that regard. And finally, on the matter of political prisoners, which are, as I say, a looking glass into the pandemics, I'd like to just reference for a moment the case of Nasrin Sotoudeh, the iconic Iranian woman and human rights lawyer, known in Iran as the Mandela of Iran, who has gone down the line for women, for juveniles destined for execution, for imprisoned journalists, for rights of minorities, for imprisoned lawyers, for other political prisoners. Until 2 years ago, she not only became a political prisoner, a woman in her mid-50s, but was sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence for a woman of her age. And to add to this dystopian situation, 2 days after that conviction and sentence, Iran was elected to the UN Commission on Women's Rights. And so we see here the culture of impunity underpinning the culture of corruption and criminality. And I'll just close by making just one reference to what happened here in Canada that may allow us to end on an optimistic note, as Mike said as well. 2 days ago, we had a state funeral for Canada's 17th Prime Minister, the Right Honorable John Turner, who served very briefly as Prime Minister, but left an important legacy as Justice Minister, perhaps the most important and progressive and impactful Justice Minister that we ever had. I had the privilege that my first public service employment was working for him between 1968 and 1972. He became not only my mentor, colleague, friend, and inspiration. The lessons learned with him were lessons that underpin my work as a parliamentarian and justice minister 50 years later. And the one lesson that I never forgot, and which has guided me in our work and which inspires the work that Mike Abramowitz and you and what you do for all of us, when he kept telling us all the time, remember, democracy does not die by accident. Democracy dies when we are not working for democracy. That media freedom dies not by accident, but when we are not engaged in the promotion and protection of media freedom. So those inspirational lessons and the inspirational work of both of you are really which can underpin what I hope will be a brighter spring after the pandemic winter.
Thank you, Erwin, and thank you, Mike. That actually leads perfectly into the question I'd like to pose first to both of you. Maybe Erwin, you could take a crack at it first, which is how did we get here? I mean, Mike talked about a 14-year decline in democratic freedoms across the globe, and a retraction from progress of previous decades. Erwin, you talked about UN institutions, among others, that should be curbs and guardrails on authoritarian behavior, and instead, in the instances you mentioned, appear to be acting as enablers. What went wrong, and is there any common thread among the things that have gone wrong?
Well, you know, it wasn't all that long ago that Francis Fukuyama was writing about the end of history, in the sense that liberal democracy was here to stay and to underpin all we do. And yet we've seen, you know, this erosion of democracy and this resurgence of global authoritarianism. I'm reminded of some of the lessons of another great mentor of mine, and known to Mike because he inspired the work at the Holocaust Museum, a Nobel Peace Laureate, Elie Wiesel, who would speak about the dangers of silence in the face of evil, of the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity. In fact, what makes for example, the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda so unspeakable is not only the horror of the genocide itself, where 10,000 Tutsis were murdered every day for 3 months. What makes that genocide so unspeakable is that it was preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. In Darfur, nobody could say we did not know. And in fact, in Syria, where we are witnessing the worst humanitarian catastrophe since the end of the Second World War, once again, nobody could say that we did not know. So I think the lessons of Elie Wiesel, of the need to stand up and be counted and not look around to see whoever else is standing before we make a judgment to do so. Because in the world in which we are living in, regrettably, there are too few who are prepared to stand, let alone to be counted.
Mike, what do you think has gone off the rails, and why?
Sure, it's a great question. Probably, 3,000 books and magazine articles have been expended on this subject, so I'm not going to do it justice in 3 minutes, but
no pressure.
Let me give you 2 or 3 things that I think about when I think about your question. First of all, I do think it's not a coincidence that the erosion of democracy has coincided with, roughly speaking, sort of the beginning of the kind of great economic kind of collapses of the first decade of the 21st century. And I think what you saw is many democracies, including the United States and some countries in Britain, in Western Europe, being unable to kind of deliver widespread economic growth that also delivered for people. If you think about people in Western Pennsylvania or Michigan, or the rural parts of England. So I think that created an opening for these kind of populist regimes, and I think it's sometimes it takes a while for that to play out. But I think it's in our own country. I think Donald Trump is a product of that phenomenon. I think secondly, I think a very critical factor was the turn that Russia took when Vladimir Putin took office in I believe 1999. And if you look at the Freedom House reports in the 90s, Russia was not was a partly free country. It was going in a good direction. It wasn't perfect, but it had a lively media. It had a lively civil society, and Putin basically took the country in quite an illiberal direction. And I think what's significant about Putin is that he kind of created the model that other authoritarians copied. And it's a model that includes not so much violence, but the threat of violence, but also the kind of corruption of important institutions of democracy, the courts, where you pack the courts, where you kind of take over the media. You have your cronies buy up all the news outlets, where you pass laws to inhibit the ability of people to protest and civil society to do its job. And gradually over time, people become less free. And I think that model has become the model for Erdogan in Turkey, for Orban in Hungary. Chavez followed a similar model, from the left in Venezuela. So I think Putin played a big factor. And then I think really, and I think about this also from my former profession of being a journalist, I think the kind of incredible transformation of the media landscape and really the rise of social media. If you just remember 10 years ago, roughly or so, when the Arab Spring happened, we all thought that Facebook and social media was going to be a force for good, and Facebook was responsible for bringing people into Tahrir Square to advocate for the overthrow of Mubarak. But what happened is the bad guys essentially learned how to manipulate social media and use it to undermine elections, to foment hate, to incite genocide or mass atrocities in places like Burma or other countries. So I think we've not yet kind of come to grips with the powerful tool that the internet has been for the bad guys. So those would just be three factors that I think about when I think about your question.
I want to pick up on the question of technology and whether it in the main is being used as a tool to expand freedom of thought or in the main to be a way that authoritarians can exert greater control and actually track people. I mean, obviously both things are happening at once. If you had to bet, maybe looking down the road 10 years from now, which, and with the benefit of nearly that amount of time since the Tahrir Square example, right? We've seen a lot that's changed in that space of time. Where do you think technology will be seen as, largely a force for good or largely the reverse? I'll go to you first on that, Mike.
Well, I think this is a decisive question for policymakers. And I think you do see governments in Western Europe, not so much our government here, but I think you do see governments trying to push the platforms to be more responsible, to be more aggressive about taking hate speech off the internet. I mean, you got to be careful there because it has to be done in a transparent way and has to be done in a way that doesn't infringe legitimate political speech. And what you don't want to happen is countries, and we saw like in one of our reports in recent years, about 24 countries had cracked down on journalists and on free speech on the internet in the name of combating fake news. So I think you do see some work being done there, but I think this is a decisive problem for policymakers that they have to figure out, because you have two competing public goods here. You have free speech and free expression, which I believe in profoundly, but then you also have the ability to have elections, which are being threatened by some of these social media platforms. So it's a balancing act. I really hope that we're going to begin to get our act together in addressing this, but it's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, Erwin, you're able to use platforms like Facebook in your work, right? I mean, you can get word out and unify people, constituencies behind some of the causes and cases you take on in a way that really could not be done, certainly not as swiftly or as effectively without social media. But at the same time, obviously, every country involved here can follow you, look at what you're doing, understand who is unifying behind some of the political prisoners and others you seek to help. What role do you see technology and social media in particular playing, more good than bad, more bad than good?
Well, I remember something I said 15 years ago when I was Minister of Justice. I said that while technology races, the law lags. And once again, the technologists are beating the lawyers. And I was reminded of this recently in a webinar with Maria Ressa, herself an iconic exponent of freedom of expression, one of the most courageous journalists today in Duarte's Philippine. And nobody could accuse her of not protecting or in fact embracing freedom of expression and media freedom. And yet she expressed her concern about what she called the weaponization of the social media, that this could bring about, as she put it, the death of democracy by 1,000 cuts. And she said that in effect, the platforms of which you spoke on have been able to continue unregulated. And for example, in Canada recently, in the speech of the throne announcing the government's forthcoming platform and agenda, reference was made to the fact that the platforms can no longer continue to go unregulated here in Canada, where they don't pay taxes, etc. So in other words, there's a whole set of legal initiatives now to allow, if you will, the lawyers and the human rights people to catch up with the technology so that we can protect both freedom of expression and democracy, and where technology can be used for the purposes for which we sought it to be served, that it could be the super highway for the transport of information and be the lifeblood of democracy, and not be the super highway for the transport of hate and the undermining of democracy.
Yeah. Mike, you spoke a few minutes ago about the role of the United States and its own backsliding, and how I think it's important to note that Donald Trump is more symptom than cause here. But Donald Trump will not be here forever. He will either be voted out this year or in 4 years. And I wonder what you make of U.S. influence and coercive power, both now and whenever we have a different president, and what the United States could and should be doing to use that power both now and in the future.
Well, let me say at Freedom House, we approach this really from the point of view that the United States has a very important role to play in the global struggle for human rights and freedom. We approach this question, with humility. I think, anyone who's looked at U.S. history and looked at the ongoing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, who's looked at some of the terrible mistakes that have been made in foreign policy, whether it's the Vietnam War or the Iraq War. I mean, we're not a perfect tribune, but on the other hand, we are this potential force for good, and I think the reality is that people do pay attention to what happens in the United States. And I mean, I see this at Freedom House because we work on the ground around the world with hundreds of brave human rights activists, journalists, and others. We help support them in many ways: emergency assistance, training, and so forth, moral support, legal support. And they pay close attention to what's happening in the United States. There's no other country like us. And when the United States retreats from the cause of human rights and democracy, the bad guys fill the void. You just look at what's happened in Syria, which is quite possibly the most egregious human rights violation over the last 10 years, where millions of people killed in a terrible civil war. So I really do believe that the United States plays a very important role on these issues, and I do think that it's going to take a while for us, to recover that. But I do think people of goodwill, want the U.S. to be playing a constructive role here. Erwin mentioned the terrible things that are happening at the UN Human Rights Council, and that is no question that is a really troubled institution. And the fact that the countries that Erwin mentioned that are going to be on the council is a moral disgrace. But we pulled out of the Human Rights Council. We're not even trying to fight. And if the United States withdraws from the battlefield, then we have no one to blame but ourselves if other people fill the vacuum. So I think it's really important for the U.S. to play a very supportive role of human rights around the world.
And the U.S. pulled out twice from the Human Rights Council, and in both cases said it was causing more harm than good, and the United States didn't want to be part of a sham operation. It's hard to argue with that on sort of on one level, right? I mean, it is a sham operation, and our participation in it only serves to legitimize it. Is one way to look at it. Would you advise a President Biden to rejoin?
You're putting that question to me or to?
I'll throw it out to both of you. You can advise an American president.
Well, no, I'll just try to contextualize it in terms of what Mike said. I would advise, if I were ever enough to rejoin, because I believe in that French aphorism, les absents sont toujours retardés. If you're not there, you're not be able to influence. And we in Canada, and I think in the international community, used to look to the United States with all its imperfections, whether we talk about systemic rape, but we looked at the United States, as being the leader of a rules-based international order. We looked at the United States as being the leader for an alliance of democracies in the pursuit of freedom and international justice. Regrettably, the retreat by the US has undermined a rules-based international order. I remember, and Mike made reference to Syria, where President Obama's red lines with regard to Syria ended up being a kind of pink advisory as the regrettably killing went on. And with regard to the Trump administration, you've seen not only a retreat, but you've seen a divisive, polarizing politics, which sometimes was prepared to indulge more Putin's Russia or Putin than it was Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau or other leaders of the community of democracy. So regrettably, this necessary leadership that the US can provide and has provided has not only been marked by retreat, but a kind of dysfunctional leadership that has been undermining the rules-based international order and the multilateral alliance for democracy.
I have a question from the audience about sanctions as a tool to help in this struggle to punish wrongdoers and promote human rights or freedoms. It's been the weapon of choice for the United States for quite a long time. Certainly, the Obama administration slapped sanctions right and left. And the Trump administration has followed suit. I think it's hard to show where those sanctions had a particular beneficial effect on human rights. Certainly, that hasn't been the case in either Iran or in Venezuela. I think Navalny would probably argue that hasn't been the case in the sanctions the United States has placed on Russia as well. It's more a U.S. impulse than a Canadian or an international one, but certainly international sanctions are a tool as well. I wonder what each of you thinks of sanctions as an effective tool, or have we sort of run the course on what sanctions can do? Is any dictator around the world quaking in his boots at the thought of more U.S. or international sanctions?
Erwin, why don't you
Mike,
go?
You want to take that for you? Oh, okay.
Well, I was going to just say, I think, look, there's no silver bullet here, but I do think one of the interesting developments in the human rights field over the last 5 years has been the development of these more targeted sanctions that were, named after Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer for Bill Browder, who was who was killed in a Russian jail, and Browder, worked with lots of groups, including Freedom House, on getting the U.S. this tool in which you can really, as opposed to going after whole countries, surgically target the purveyors of mass corruption or egregious human rights violations. And I mean, I do believe that many of these violators, they want access to the U.S. banking system. They want access to the international banking system. They want to be able to send their kids to, boarding schools in Geneva, or, boarding schools in England. So I think this does have a potential deterrent effect. I mean, I think, we've just started to use them. So, we'll see how it goes, but I'm hopeful about this. But I will say it's interesting, and the Chinese turn turn the tables on us. When the United States imposed sanctions on individual Hong Kong and Chinese officials for the human rights violations in Hong Kong, the Chinese sanctioned me and four other heads of international human rights groups and a number of U.S. legislators, and it's more symbolic. But I think the Chinese, want to show that they can play at this game too. But I'm hopeful in general for the effectiveness in the long term of these targeted sanctions.
Yeah, I also I'm hopeful. And I think that what's important is to distinguish the Magnitsky sanctions from other sets of sanctions. They don't, as Mike said, they don't target a particular country. They target individuals. And in their targeting of individuals, what they do is say, we are seeking justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators. And, Boris Nemtsov, who was also very close with Bill Browder, the leader of the Russian democracy movement, he came to Canada to support Magnitsky sanctions when I introduced legislation to that effect back in 2011. And somebody said to him, "Aren't these sanctions anti-Russian?" He said, "No, these are the most pro-Russian sanctions you can find. These are sanctions that can only be on behalf of and help the Russian people." And then he went on to say, "And while we may not be able to, in fact, do as much as we would like to do, read the impunity in Russia, as he said, this will also allow you in Canada to protect your sovereignty, your economy, your security, your integrity, and also to let us know that we are not alone." Now, the whole hope here is to have a global justice for Sergei Magnitsky movement. So it isn't just one country that's imposing these sanctions like the US or Canada. As we are meeting now, the European Union is on the threshold of adopting sanctions. If we get the whole European community involved, joining as well with Canada and the UK, now no longer part of it, of the EU, but United States, we can have a global justice for Sergei Magnitsky movement. And that, I think, can be an inspiring framework.
We are meeting here on approximately the 2-year anniversary of Jamal Khashoggi's murder in Istanbul at the hands of a Saudi hit squad sent there to do that, and basically utter impunity. There has been a backlash and some punishment in Saudi Arabia, which wouldn't have happened without an international outcry. But the idea that the Saudi authorities thought that they could get away with this, it is sort of boggles the mind, or maybe it doesn't. And I wonder what both of you think about just the mere fact that until called on it, MBS in Saudi Arabia seemed to think that this was a perfectly fine idea, and what it says may be something slightly hopeful, that the world reacted as it did, and essentially, although there's been no very specific consequences for MBS himself, you know, the idea that he will carry that for the remainder of his time as a ruler, it will always be an asterisk next to his name. Is there some value in the public outcry that followed Khashoggi's death?
Well, you know, I might just speak about, there was a public outcry after the death, but regrettably, it was the silence which led to the death. Let me just categorize that because it brings a lot of the themes together. Some 2.5 years ago, the then Foreign Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, tweeted a call for the release of the Saudi blogger Raif Badawi and his sister Samar Badawi, who was one of the leaders of those who were calling for the right to drive. A reform which MBS instituted, but then imprisoned the women who called for the right to drive. As Badawi language is in prison for saying, let's say 8 years ago, what the Crown Prince is saying today. Now, after she tweeted that call, our foreign minister tweeted a call, Saudi Arabia erupted in fury. They ejected the Canadian ambassador. They recalled the Saudi ambassador from Canada. They suspended all trade and investment with Canada. They recalled 15,000 students, really somewhat of a self-inflicted wound, Saudi students who were in Canada.
Right.
But the real issue here was the silence of the democracies. Not one democracy, and particularly the United States, came to Canada's defense. 2 months later, we had the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And I always felt that it was the silence of the democracies that enabled MBS to believe that he could conduct himself with impunity and that he would have, among others, the US leadership behind him. Now, after there was an outcry after the Khashoggi murder, as we find the situation, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia is about to be elected to the UN Human Rights Council, and even more, to preside as the chair of the next meeting of the G20. So that's why I say that what concerns me is not only cultures of corruption and criminality, but the impunity which underpins it. And we have to call out the Saudi Arabian leadership for not only the unresolved murder with respect to Khashoggi, but in fact to the continuing criminality underpinned by impunity.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Erwin said, I agree with everything that he just said. And I would also say, Anne, that the silence is really what's so galling. We understand that there are going to be trade-offs between human rights and idealism and national security interests, and the United States certainly has other interests in the kingdom that need to be taken into account. But we have to strongly register that was an appalling act of barbarism that was just to me just exceeded. It really went so far. And if I could just add 2 points on that. First of all, it was a little bit rich that the country that kind of blew the whistle on Saudi Arabia was itself one of the most egregious violators of press freedom in the world, Turkey. And so you had the president of Turkey who was, called because of his own reasons,
Right.
Saudi Arabia, while he had, hundreds of journalists and civil society and human rights people in his own jail. So there was a bit of kind of irony about that. The larger point I want to make is that I think the Saudi action against Khashoggi has to be seen as part of a very large and disturbing global trend in which authoritarian countries like Saudi Arabia, like China, like Russia, they're not only content to repress people inside, they're going beyond their borders to intimidate the people in the diaspora. So there was a case some of the listeners may remember a few weeks ago, where in a very strange situation, the Rwandan government essentially rendered one of their fiercest critics, Paul Rusesabagina, who is famous for the saving lives during the Hotel Rwanda story that was told in Hollywood, and they somehow got him back, to Rwanda. And President Kagame's security services also accused of assassinating their opponents in other countries, and they're not alone. At Freedom House, we're tracking this. We call it transnational repression, and there are literally dozens and dozens of these cases. So this is a real challenge for the democracy. Are they going to allow these authoritarian countries to not only tamper with their own countries, but to tamper with the democratic societies where we enjoy these freedoms? It's a profound question.
Yeah, you see that also with the national security legislation. It not only impacts on democracy in Hong Kong, but it has the potential to criminalize those outside of Hong Kong in our own democracies who, if they offer support for the democracy in Hong Kong, could be potentially subject to that national security legislation. So the internationalization really of the resurgent global authoritarianism, their penetration of the community of democracies is something that is really disconcerting. And we've seen this in reports in Canada about the penetration by both Russia and China, not only into our parliamentary system, but not only into our cultural arena, but also into our campus culture.
We have a question from a viewer in Venezuela who asks what the rest of the world makes of the situation there, and essentially what can be done outside of Venezuela. I mean, I guess I would add to that question. I mean, what can any other country or community of citizens do if a leader is willing to impoverish his country and his people, and essentially, ruin one of the best economies in the Western Hemisphere, and take a democracy, a well-educated, wealthy democracy back, 100 years? What if that is those are willing acts, or the result of them is the foreseeable result is something that the leader is willing to live with. What can anyone do about it?
No, I don't mind taking a stab on this. This is something that had some involvement. Some 3 years ago, the Organization of American States appointed a 3-person sort of commission of inquiry. A judge from Argentina, one from Costa Rica, and myself from Canada, to inquire into whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity were being committed in Maduro's Venezuela. And a year later, after an exhaustive inquiry, including public hearings as well, we determined that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela. The worst, I would say, was state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering of the weaponization of food and medicine, and we've seen the tragic, humanitarian consequences. Some 6 months after our report, the then Foreign Minister of Canada led a group of democracies, both in Latin America and France and Germany from Europe, to make the first ever collective referral of a state party to the International Criminal Court in its history to the ICC for prospective investigation and prosecution. And this comes to the point, they're saying about what could be done. Regrettably, 2 years later, no investigation has been opened up, notwithstanding the evidence and the reports. But 2 weeks ago, we had a report from the UN Human Rights Commission, which not only affirmed our report that crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, but that the situation had in fact worsened, with increased number of people disappeared, tortured, and the like. And so the question at this point, I would just enumerate in terms of what needs to be done. Number one, we need to revisit that initiative before the International Criminal Court and call for the opening of the investigation, particularly in the light now of the UN Human Rights Commission report. Number two, we need an initiative, and I gather that as we meet, this is about to happen, an initiative against Venezuela before the International Court of Justice with regard to its massive torture of its inhabitants. Number three, the use of universal jurisdiction to prosecute those involved in these crimes against humanity in any of our jurisdictions where they in fact can be found and arrested. And number four, suspend Venezuela from the UN Human Rights Council. After the UN Human Rights Commission has now produced a report that says Maduro is guilty of crimes against humanity, how it can continue to sit on that very UN Human Rights Council is to me appalling. And all this to help us move towards free and fair elections and hold Maduro regime accountable and bring justice for the people of Venezuela.
Mike, did you want to add to that?
I think Erwin said it pretty well. I think the thing that's very complicated about Venezuela is it's actually an area where the United States is not trying to act unilaterally. There are other countries in the region, countries from Europe that would like to see Maduro go and recognize that it's kind of an untenable situation, not just frankly from a democracy and human rights point of view, but from just a whole of society point of view. It's a failed state. Very, very
and countries in the region feel the same, right? I mean, Mexico is not happy with the situation.
No one is happy with the situation. I think we have to remind ourselves that this is another case where bad actors are also, fueling the problem. Russia, Cuba, they're some of the strongest backers in the world of the Maduro regime. And so you have a situation in which really the authoritarian elite are trying to support each other. And it makes it very, very difficult for people of goodwill, for people of the free world to try to do something. And honestly, there are not a lot of tools left. The country's been sanctioned heavily. I think Erwin mentioned some legal tools that might be interesting, and I think they ought to be followed to see what can happen. But it's really a sad situation that I'm not sure how the story is going to end right now.
Yeah. And you mentioned the very strong role of Russia and Cuba in propping up the Maduro regime. We have a viewer who would like you both to comment on the role of China in Latin America and whether China is seeing opportunities to expand its influence in Latin America as the U.S. retreats a bit. I mean, obviously the same can be true in Africa as well, but the question is specific to Latin America. Erwin, you want to take that?
Well, reference was made to, China's involvement, particularly with regard to the Maduro regime, along with Russia, and I might add Iran and Hezbollah. And as you mentioned, we see China in Africa, and I can go on. I think the real issue here is that, China is globalizing its influence, and Latin America is just one case study, while the democracies are either in a state of divisiveness or internal preoccupation or polarization, and we have an absence of leadership there. But I'll turn this over to Mike because I think he's got his finger on the pulse of this issue.
Well, I'm not sure I can speak intelligently, sadly, about Latin America in particular, but I do think the issue of, in general, China globalizing its influence is a real challenge to the world. Xi Jinping at one of the party congresses several years ago, really said, he's holding up the China model as an attractive model of development. And
2017, yeah.
The Road Initiative, the one thing we found at Freedom House was the export of some of the surveillance techniques, some of the tools of repression that they use in places like Xinjiang. They're trying to take to other countries and train other countries. This is really a big problem for the world. It's a wake-up call, if you will, that China is, we're in I hate to say it's a Cold War again, but China is trying to exert its influence around the world, including in our own country, and we need to wake up to that.
I mean, another thing China's trying to do clearly as well is to consolidate its influence in its own backyard. We've certainly, Hong Kong is the best known example probably in the West, but now we see some pretty menacing moves with regard to Taiwan. What should the United States, Canada, or the community of nations do if China moves to strip the last remaining rights and privileges from Hong Kong, and especially were it to invade Taiwan?
Well, invading Taiwan would, I mean, and you're the diplomatic correspondent here. That would be an event of world historical significance, and your guess is as good as mine as how the United States would react to it. But I think that would, I mean, I hope that's not where Xi Jinping is headed with this. I think they tried to interfere in the last election there, and support the other team, so to speak, and it backfired. Taiwan is a thriving democracy. They did not take well to efforts to interfere in the democracy there. I will say I'd say two things that this might be worth considering. That I'm not sure that China's saber rattling in its own winning friends and making it popular. I think, when I talk to my Asian friends, I think there is a lot of resentment in the region towards some of China's behavior. So, and I also think that Xi Jinping, all dictators seem strong before the fall. And, there's a lot of, China is still a very open country in many ways to the West. And I think the assumption that his belligerence and increasing effort to kind of exercise more repressive apparatus against the Chinese people is popular. I'm not sure I totally buy that. And I think maybe we'll find in 5 years that he was not so popular after all.
China has been effectively targeting what it calls the five poisons and intensifying its targeting. I'm referring to the Uyghurs, the Hong Kong, the Falun Gong, Tibet, and Taiwan, as you mentioned. At the same time, and it's not all that well known, China is the country that has jailed more journalists than any other country in the world, and engaged in massive domestic repression of doctors and dissidents, which led to the spread of the coronavirus also to begin with. And what happens if countries seek to stand up is China leverages its power, and particularly its economic power, and targets each of these countries like Australia and Canada and others one by one. And that's why some 4 months ago, we formed the first ever interparliamentary alliance on China. I'm one of the co-chairs from Canada, and we now have some 25 democracies that are part of this interparliamentary alliance. And it's had some, I think, important developments, because we were the first to reveal the extent of acts constitutive of genocide regarding the Uyghurs. We came out with a report just 2 weeks ago with regard to the forced labor in Tibet and so on. So what I think we need at this point is a parallel alliance, an intergovernmental alliance to parallel the interparliamentary alliance. So none of the democracies like Australia or Canada will need to stand alone and be bullied by China. And one encouraging thing occurred just yesterday, where 39 countries, mostly democracies, at the Third Committee of the United Nations called China to task for its violations, really, of the Uyghurs and of Hong Kong. Now, this is important because a year ago, only 21 countries were prepared to stand up. Now we had 39, almost double. And you see the changing public opinion with respect to China, where 80% in many of the democracies now simply do not trust Xi Jinping's regime. So my sense is, if we can create a critical mass on an intergovernmental level, on an interparliamentary level, on a civil society level, then we may be able to turn the dynamics around.
I would note that one other thing that China has done is kick out international journalists, including from the Washington Post, and now there's a sort of a tit for tat going between the U.S. and China, the number of journalists here who were, basically state media, but journalists nonetheless who were credentialed in the United States have also been kicked out. So that is a race to the bottom, in my view. We are past the hour mark, and we should probably wrap up fairly soon. But I wanted to note a question that came in US Senator Mike Lee tweeted today that democracy is not the objective in America. Quote, liberty, peace, and prosperity, end quote, are. If people are prosperous, have peace, and can vote, why do they need democracy?
You know, I saw that tweet. It was an odd tweet. I didn't really quite know what he was getting at. I mean, I think at the end of the day, democracy is the only system of government in which liberty and freedom can thrive. I mean, what's the alternative? And I think that was a very odd thing that he said. I don't know really what he was getting at, but I do think democracy in the end is that system is the only system. The alternative is systems by which any individual would not choose to be ruled on if they had the choice to do it. I think you have to have a system in which you select your leader, and that people have the right to select their leaders, and that the conditions are set up so that that selection can be done in a free way.
Well, I remember what the Prague Declaration on Democratic Renewal said 3 years ago. Mike, you were one of the signatories to it, where it said democracy everywhere is under threat, and those who care about it must come to its defense. Because while it may still be seen by some as not the best form of government, it is certainly the best form of government as against any other form of government.
A terrible system, except when you compare it to all the others, right? Well, that might be where we leave it. Does either of you want to make any closing remarks, or should we bid our audience good night?
I just want to end on one optimistic note, if I may, because we learned today that a courageous Iranian human rights political prisoner, Narj Mohammadi, who has herself been not only a human rights defender, journalist, advocate on behalf of others, was released today from prison. And she was in a corona-invested prison. I think this resulted from the sustained international advocacy. And I'm glad that in this case, though so far only in this case, that Khamenei's regime did the right thing. I hope if we can continue our sustained advocacy, we can bring about also the release of the Nasrin Sotoudeh and all the others who are unjustly imprisoned and subject to the COVID pandemic in prison.
I think it's a great note to end on. I first of all want to thank Anne and thank Erwin. It's just really fun to be with both of you. And I want to thank our sponsors, the Spruce Peak Performing Arts Center, the Raoul Wallenberg Center, Freedom House, and the Jewish community of Stowe. Thank you for sponsoring this great event. But I do think if you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, things seem grim, but there are some real bright spots. Millions of people hitting the streets in Hong Kong to demand their freedom, a dictator overthrown in Sudan, a political opening in Ethiopia that we didn't think was coming. Belarus, the most entrenched dictator in Europe, is on hopefully his last legs. People prefer democracy and freedom over the other choice. We have to remind ourselves that. And so I think eventually we're going to be going in a good direction. We just have to keep fighting.
Great. Well, thanks to you both. Thanks to Freedom House. Thanks to the Raoul Wallenberg Center, Jewish community of Stowe, the Spruce Peak Art Center. This was a really a fascinating and enjoyable evening. Some difficult subjects, but we covered a lot of ground. And I really thank our audience for participating. And thanks again to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And again, Mike, thank you and Freedom House for all you do. We are all the beneficiaries of your great work.
Thank you.